Brooks Newmark, former Conservative MP and Minister, who's helped to evacuate more than 10,000 civilians from Ukraine this year. Brooks, we're going to hear a lot more about that over the course of the next hour. Hashi Mohamed, another regular barrister and broadcaster who's the author of the book People Like Us, What It Takes to Make It in Modern Britain. And Jack Blanchard is UK editor of Politico. Now, I'm sure anyone in the political world knows what Politico is, but just for our listeners that maybe don't, what is it?
It's an American-owned media company that's slowly taking over the world.
It is.
Sending emails to you about what's going on in politics, and you can sign up for them for free if you want.
You can, and very good they are too. Right, let's go to our first questioner. James is in Birmingham. Hello, James.
Hello, good evening, and good evening, panel. My question is just straightforward. How long can the UK carry on backing Ukraine with the war financially and militarily? Because it seems to me there's no short-term solution with this whatsoever, and it's going to be. Because me, from my personal views, it is a internal problem with Russia, and us getting involved, it was not really financially viable for us in this situation. Now we've got people who are dying, lack of food, lack of heating in this country. I mean, we're already talking about power cuts. So, do we put our people first? That's my question.
How is it an internal problem when Ukraine is a sovereign country which has been invaded by an external country?
Okay, well, that is just something which, it's far more complicated than that. I mean, since Ukraine was set up and the Russians obviously didn't want to have any sort of reason for that country to be able to join NATO, because obviously Putin is he wants to have a buffer zone and doesn't want to have a NATO country on his doorstep. And I think if we had tackled this from the start and looked at his concerns, because I looked into this as well, they were saying we just want to.
You're just a Putin apologist, aren't you? Frankly.
No, not at all. I'm not. I'm just saying. Well, can we get back to what I originally said? How are our people more important?
Well, let's put your question to Brooks Newmark. Brooks.
Well, look, I totally respect people with that view. I think there are a lot of people who are in Europe, as well as the United Kingdom, as well as the United States, who are suffering economically now. And I can understand the sense of, why are we involved in this war? And just to give a little bit of context, we signed something called the Budapest Agreement in 93-94. The Ukrainians gave up their nuclear weapons in exchange for three signatories, the US, the UK, and Russia, who agreed to protect to protect Ukraine's sovereignty. And Ukraine's sovereignty and their borders included Crimea. So even though there was no legal mechanism to enforce that, we have a moral obligation, I think, to support Ukraine. Ukraine should have the freedom to decide whether they want to join NATO or not. That's not up to Putin. Putin in this war has now added another, I think, almost 900 miles of NATO's border, with Finland and Sweden now joining. So everything Putin has done has been very counterproductive to what he wanted to achieve. Now, going back to why am I involved? I've moved now, I think, close to 20,000 women and children away from the war zones. I have been a witness.
When you say you've moved them, just explain what that process is.
Sure. So I've set up 8 hubs around Ukraine, in close to where each of the war zones, Kharkiv, Dnipro, Mykolaiv, Odessa, Zaporizhia, and so on. And I've now got relationships with all the local governments there. So they will literally call me. I have 20 buses. I have 20 ambulances now that I have access to, and they will call me up almost every day and say, okay, we need people moving from here to there. Now, people have no money. It's now 6 or 7 months into the war, so they don't even have the $10 or $20 or pounds to actually go from A to B. So I've been really moving around all around the war zone, really hoiking people away and moving them away from where the bombs are landing. So to give you one example quickly, because I know I'm short of time here. 3 weeks ago, I went east of Kharkiv, just before actually the Ukrainians moved in. And we'd managed to negotiate moving out over 1,000 women and children from a Russian-controlled area east of Kharkiv. Now, we did that, which included moving 500 meters of landmines, which we managed to do, and got them to safety. In the absence of that, and in the absence of the Ukrainians going in, they would continue to starve because they have no work, they have no food. So I think the work that I'm doing with my team now, I think is hopefully making a difference.
So in terms of James's question, how long do you think the UK's support for Ukraine can last? I mean, you clearly are in it for the long term. Do you think that Britain as a country has to be in it for the long term?
Yes, I think it's the obligation of those who believe in freedom and democracy versus autocracy to do their best to defend the Ukrainians against an illegal invasion, but not only just an illegal invasion, the violence that the Russians are doing, both directly as soldiers, particularly on the women, in addition to deliberately targeting civilian buildings, schools, hospitals, and so on, breaks every rule. I mean, Putin, I hope, if there's any mechanism to get up for war crimes, I hope we manage to do it.
We talked about that in the last hour. I think that's going to be easier said than done, isn't it? Hashi Mohamed.
Well, I think that this is a very important thing for us to be a part of. I really understand and also appreciate that people are hurting out there and there are some difficult financial choices to make. But ultimately, Ukraine is a sovereign country with its leadership and its people fighting an illegal invasion by all accounts, by anyone who understands the legal principles that are at play here. And so for me, it's quite straightforward. As long as the Ukrainian government is resisting, we have a duty and an obligation, both morally and legally, to help out. And I know that it's expensive, I know it costs money, but actually in the grand scheme of things, what we are contributing is much more than just money. We're contributing a lot of intelligence, we're contributing moral support, we're contributing in the way in which we're taking in refugees, we're contributing in the way in which we are coordinating a great deal of international communities, talking to each other and actually putting some pressure as much as they can to bear. Do I think that it will make a difference in the long run? I don't know. But does that mean that there is a choice to be made that we should just leave that region and that area to Putin to do what he likes? Well, that's never worked before. We know what he did before in 2014, and here he is again. So, on balance, I think it makes sense, and we need to be able to stay there as long as we can.
What about the argument that the people in this country, and particularly in countries that are more reliant on Russian gas than we are going to die because of this?
I see that, and that is, for me, not a problem for the Ukrainians or the Russians. That's, in a way, our fault for never having had the strategic foresight and have actually planned for our own energy independence. And now that it's come back to bite us...
Trump was right.
Well, I mean, maybe if we'd never had that strategic foresight to be able to think about those things beforehand, then maybe we wouldn't be where we are. And so for me to take that choice on the short-term kind of narrow view is to not have an idea about what will come next.
Charlotte Nichols.
I think it's not about how long we can afford to support Ukraine in this conflict. It's about not being able to afford not to. Ultimately, if we were to leave the support that we've been providing to Ukraine behind, if we were to not have been involved in that conflict, I don't think that makes us any safer, even before you get into, what it means for Ukraine's sovereignty as a country. We've seen the Russians targeting things like nuclear power stations, for example. Clearly, the bombing of places like that could have an impact that spreads far from Ukraine's border. We've seen what Putin's been doing again with cutting off gas supplies to the rest of Europe. And, I agree with Hashi that ultimately that's a failure of our industrial strategy and not being resilient enough as a nation in energy security. But again, why should it be the Ukrainians that have to pay the price for that? And up and down the country, MPs will have a significant volume of new Ukrainian constituents, as I do, who I've met recently, who are worried sick about what's happening over there. and how long this is going to carry on. I think the more support we provide, hopefully the quicker that we can bring this conflict to an end. But as I said, it takes as long as it takes, and we've got to be in it for as long as it takes.
How important do you think the Ukrainian PR campaign, if I can put it that way, has been? Because, I've interviewed countless Ukrainian MPs, all of whom seem to be the most eloquent people I've ever met, and have done such a fantastic job, I think, in convincing the British public of all sorts of different political persuasions why this country should be staunch in its support for Ukraine.
I think it's partly, as you said, the kind of PR, but I think it's actually how black and white it is as an issue almost. It's very clear to look at as, what's right and what's wrong. There are other conflicts in other parts of the world that perhaps people feel, less able to comment on, have less of an understanding of the history of, maybe aren't quite sure either way which side is, the side that we should be supporting. But I think this one was pretty clear cut, and I think having people right at the top of the Ukrainian government like Zelensky, who has been really keen to speak to MPs and politicians in this country. I was there when he addressed both houses of Parliament here in the Commons, which was an incredibly emotional thing to
Did you
be
cry?
there for.
I
did,
would have
and
done. I
I have
would
to
have
say
done.
I'm quite a cold person,
No.
but that even warmed my icy heart. So it was, and again, seeing what that meant to the Ukrainians who are in my constituency, that was huge, and I'm sure that has a part to play in it.
Well, let's go to the much more emotionally intelligent Jack Blanchard.
I wouldn't go that far. But I would say, Iain, we know what happens in Europe if murderous dictators are just allowed to plough through countries and everybody just stands back and watches it happen. We've been here before. Our grandfathers can tell us what the lesson to be learned is and what the right course of action is in these situations. And it's absolutely right to stand by Ukraine in these circumstances for as long as it takes and with whatever it takes, because there is no way we as a country are going to be safer or safe at all if someone like Vladimir Putin is allowed to do whatever he likes in Eastern Europe. We have to say this far and no further, and I think we can be proud of our government for doing that and taking a lead on this really right around the world at a time obviously of a lot of political turmoil in this country. We haven't always showed our best face to the world, but on this I think we are all behind the government in what it's done.
Have you been surprised by the amount of cross-party support there has been? When Boris Johnson was Prime Minister, Keir Starmer did pay tribute to him for his leadership on Ukraine, and I think it's been quite interesting to see how much support has remained absolutely staunch on this.
He did pay tribute to him, and he was right to do so. And no, I'm not surprised, to be honest. Every single political party is in lockstep on this, because most British people are in lockstep on this. Your callers' comments are not where most people are at. They see what's happening in Ukraine. As Charlotte says, it's black and white, this one. You can see who's right and who's wrong, and they know what we have to do. And unfortunately, over the weeks and months ahead and through the winter, this is going to get worse and it's going to get scarier, because we know what Putin has got in his arsenal, and it's going to be a very difficult time for us to go through. But it's absolutely essential that this country and indeed all of Europe stands firm against him.
Right. We've got another question. In fact, it relates to something that you just said after the break. 0345 6060 973 if you'd like to put a question to our panel, or just say if you have the Alexa... is it a machine? What do you call it? An Alexa? I have one, but I very rarely use it. Alexa, send a comment to LBC and we'll put your question to our panel. It's 17 minutes past 8.
This is LBC. Leading Britain's conversation. Cross Question with Iain Dale. Tweet at LBC.
It's 19 minutes past 8. Just a reminder who's on our panel. Charlotte Nichols, Labour MP for Warrington North. Brooks Newmark, former Conservative MP and Minister. Jack Blanchard, UK editor of Politico. And Hashi Mohamed Barrister and broadcaster, who tells me he's got a new book out. Should have told me that earlier. It's called A Home of One's Own, Why the Housing Crisis Matters. Didn't Liam Halligan get there before you on this subject?
Well, I told a different story to Liam. It's a great book, Liam's book, Home Truths.
What's the theme of yours?
Well, this one's the personal aspects of why the housing crisis matters. So what are the impacts of the problem rather than the problem itself? Because it's easy to diagnose the issue.
Yeah.
It's much harder to explain to people how much opportunity is lost, how many people are just never going to be able to fulfill their full potential because they don't have a decent place to lay their heads.
I sense a housing phone-in coming on very soon with me in the studio.
I would love that. We did it last time.
We did indeed, so we must do it again. Right, let's go to another question. It's related to the last one. It's from Chris in Aberdeen. Hello, Chris.
Hi, good evening. Hello, thank you for taking my call. I'm Polish myself, so, as you can imagine, the matter of Ukraine is very close to my heart because, I've absolutely no doubt that, should Ukraine fall, Poland and other Baltic states would be Russia's next target. So there's absolutely no denying that, we basically on Russia's target should Ukraine fall. But my main question would be, as we all know, that the actual war hasn't started in February last year. It was actually 2014. So my question would be, should West response back then in 2014 should have been stronger? And if it should, why it hasn't? That would be my question. Thank you.
I think that is such a big question. I suppose in a way it's impossible to answer, but I think we never learn, do we? Because it's a bit like Syria. If you appease a dictator, if you give in to a dictator, don't be surprised if they come back for more. That would be my view. Jack Blanchard.
I mean, I don't disagree with that. All I would say is that these things are always easier in hindsight, and you need the political will to take very, very strong action in a situation that doesn't feel like as big a crisis as the full invasion of the rest of Ukraine did this year. And so I guess it's harder for politicians to corral the political support across the spectrum. Would as many people support very, very tough action at that time? It's easy in hindsight to be like, well, we should have done this, and of course we should. Of course we should. But would we all have been sitting here so unified at that time, saying it's absolutely the right thing to do?
I think I was, but I may have false memory syndrome.
Good for you. I just you know what I mean. It's not as easy to get the widespread support sometimes until it's too late.
We did actually. So what happened?
We did what?
We did go in and we began helping. So what happened was that we, at the US to a lesser extent, noticed how quickly that the Russians took over Crimea. So we began training Ukrainian soldiers. And I think the UK probably did more than most to do that, which is why the Ukrainians, in fact, were in much better shape when the second part of Putin's objective, which was to take over the whole country, they were able to fight back. So it's not as though we didn't do anything, but I take the point that if we had sort of said to the whole country, let's go in, let's do more. I think with following Afghanistan, following Iraq, following Libya, and our inaction in Syria, which you and I think probably agreed with, that we should have done a little bit more. I think there was probably no public appetite in 2014 for us to use megaphone about what we were doing. But my understanding is that we were doing a lot to begin training the Ukrainian soldiers.
That is absolutely right. But I suppose the point that I think Chris is making is, if the international community with President Obama, David Cameron, was it Francois Hollande then, I think, Angela Merkel, if they'd all got together and said to Russia, up with this, we will not put, and did similar things to what we've done now with Ukraine, things could have been very different, possibly.
But I think after Syria, I don't think we had any credibility. I think having Obama particularly, having set a red line and then not having followed up on that red line, having had the vote in the House of Commons, which was not cross-party, unfortunately, we dropped the ball. And as a result, the message to Putin in 2013, and I was there in that debate, and I had been in Syria, and I flew back for that at 3 a.m. to be at that debate. And if we had actually at that stage done something in Syria and had bombed the airfields, which is what the objective was that weekend, I think Assad would have been sipping pina coladas on the Black Sea, and I think Putin would have thought twice before going into Donbass and then going into Crimea in 2014.
Well, they say actions have consequences, but lack of action also has consequences. Charlotte?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there is sort of fairly broad consensus now that, more could have been done at the time. But as Jack said, hindsight is sometimes 20/20. I think that we have to learn the lessons, though, from, as you said, where sometimes inaction can have consequences just as much as action can. That what we don't do this time is put up a really strong sort of initial front and then kind of gradually withdraw that support, because ultimately, the signal that would send to Moscow would be absolutely catastrophic. So, in some respects, I suppose what's happened in the past has happened, but it's what we're doing going forward to make sure that we've learnt the lesson that's really key here.
I would say that we shouldn't also be so hard on ourselves, because there was an example of us stepping up when George Bush was in power, when Putin invaded Georgia. Georgia was an example of the West and NATO, and particularly backed by America, stepping forward to tell the Russians, no, you need to leave Georgian territory. And that was an example of a proper pushback that actually worked. 2014 is an example of inaction that has potentially led us to where we are. But the reality of all of this is that we had this insatiable appetite of a dictator who's been there for over 20 years and who's taken this action against Ukraine in a way, also remember, to bolster his domestic position. So it's hard for us to kind of say, what if we did this and what if we did that? But there are examples where we have done things that worked, and we shouldn't be so hard on ourselves in the time zone we haven't actually taken any action.
Do you all feel that the whole nuclear issue is being brought up quite regularly at the moment? And a lot of our listeners have been concerned about that. Well, in the first days of this invasion, I remember having calls from people saying that they were actually very anxious about it. It became a thing, war anxiety. And the more that it's discussed, I suppose the more people will believe that Putin would do it. Brooks, do you think there is a risk that Putin might launch some sort of nuclear strike either against Ukraine or conceivably, I hate to say it, against this country?
Yeah, I think it's a absolutely less than 1% probability he targets London, even though he gets very angry with Britain because of our stand in Ukraine and our general criticism of Russia generally. I think there is an increased probability that I believe he's thinking about it and wants to do it more. But I think it's also been made very clear that the moment that he drops what's referred to as a tactical nuke, which could either be on the airfield, could be done on the field of battle in eastern Ukraine, or could be on a city, although I think it's more likely to be on a battlefield, that I think within 48 hours, NATO would wipe out the entire Russian military in Ukraine. And I think Biden has made it very clear, as has Secretary of State Austin, to the Russian military themselves, that if they do this, they will be wiped out. So I think they've already suffered against a mediocre, well-trained, mediocre, well-armed military in the form of Ukraine. I think taking on the whole of NATO, I don't think the Russian military themselves. And Putin, by the way, his nuclear codes that he's got is not like the US president. He can't do it unilaterally. He needs the support of his military. So I think he would get pushback from his military.
Brief text question here from Steve in Glasgow. Should we be accepting as refugees Russian men who are fleeing the draft to help cut off Putin's supply of war fodder? Hashi?
I don't know about that. I think it would be a critical question to ask about whether those people are genuine refugees or whether they are sleeper cells coming into Britain. I don't know. I mean,
Which is something like Priti Patel.
well, I mean, I don't know is the short answer. I don't know. And how would we vet them? You know, thank God I'm not Priti Patel. But, you know, that's probably my instinct.
I mean, I feel exactly the same. That's a very difficult question to answer, and I am glad I don't have to grapple with it as a mere journalist. I think probably I'm not sure that the public would accept.
You do. You're on this programme.
Okay,
so
then
I
don't think people would accept that.
Yeah.
I think that people would struggle with large numbers of Russian guys coming here in these cities.
Yeah, I mean, I think as a lot of my friends around the rest of the Baltic states and Poland and everywhere else say, as well as obviously the Ukrainians, they're not running because they object to the war, which they've had now 7 months to object to. They're running because they don't want to be called up now and have to fight and be Putin's cannon fodder. So there's no matter of principle where they're leaving the country immediately as the war started. They're only moving now because they feel they might lose their lives.
Charlotte?
I think there will be cases of people who are genuine refugees from Russia, and particularly from certain minority ethnic groups and LGBT people who might find that they're being especially persecuted within the current context. But I think that ultimately the best way that the Russian people can avoid war is that, you know, political pressure and some of the really brave demonstrations and things that we've seen inside of Russia, you know, that strikes me as a much better way of avoiding the draft than a sort of policy of wholesale acceptance of any Russian men who want to come to the UK.
Great. We'll take more questions from you in a moment. The number to call 0345 6060 973. And the first question after the news is going to be our first Alexa question. It's 8:31. News headlines with Daryl Jackson.
Ukraine says it's facing a new wave of aggression after Russia unleashed its biggest and most widespread attacks in months. It's thought more than 80 missiles were targeted at infrastructure across the country, killing at least 11 people and injuring dozens more. A jury's started hearing opening statements in the trial of a nurse who denies murdering 7 babies at a neonatal unit in Chester. Lucy Letby is accused of injecting air into their bloodstream or poisoning them with insulin. Scotland's First Minister says the UK government's utterly failing to help people struggling during the cost of living crisis. Nicola Sturgeon's told the SNP conference that, among other policies, there'll be an extra cash payment for families on benefits in Scotland this Christmas. LBC weather, a few showers in northern Scotland tonight, clear spells in the south, drier tomorrow with patchy cloud and sunny spells, highs of 15 degrees.
This is LBC. Cross Question with Iain Dale on LBC. Text 84850.
8:34 on LBC. Charlotte Nichols, Brooks Newmark, Hashi Mohamed and Jack Blanchard with us taking your questions. Gordon says, I'm so excited by Alexa questions. Let's face it, I need to get out more. Bridget has our first Alexa question. It is, do you think Liz Truss will be Prime Minister at Christmas? Charlotte?
I mean, I think that she's had an appalling start, to put it mildly, but I'm not sure how much discontent there is yet within the Conservative Party, not least because, we've only had sort of 5 or 6 days of parliamentary time since about July, thanks to all the different recesses and obviously the mourning period and everything else. It's quite difficult to get a temperature check, when we've all been back in our constituencies. But I think this week will be the first real test, and be able to sense check that, I suppose, within Parliament.
Were you in the chamber for her first PMQs against Keir Starmer?
Yes.
Because I thought that was really interesting in that they actually had a meaty discussion, sort of toing and froing, but there was none of the bluster that you might have got from Boris Johnson. And I wonder how long that will continue, though.
Yeah, I mean, I did actually find it quite refreshing, not least because there was some clear water between the two. Again, she seemed to be answering questions and talking about policy in a way that, Boris Johnson hasn't done, and which, particularly when it's your question that you're asking and you don't get an actual answer, is incredibly frustrating. And, it felt like maybe we were moving into an era of slightly more sensible politics and, getting things done.
And then
Obviously a couple of days later, the fiscal non-event, and everything sort of feels a bit like it's been on fire since.
Non-event, whatever it wasn't a non-event.
It wasn't the help that people were promised.
Yeah. Well, I wrote an article in the Financial Times last weekend predicting that she'll be gone by Christmas.
Did you?
But I'm not.
What was your logic?
Well, my logic was that her government is going to be lurching from one crisis to the next as we head towards December, as we see the economies sort of staggering, as this kind of crisis around the energy issue goes on to cause issues. And then, of course, they have to start governing now and actually but they've picked a fight with so many different people, and I just feel that by the time we get to December, it's going to be really, really tough. But the counter clear argument against that would be, who's going to replace her? Who is going to sort of do this job now? And I don't know, I'm not old enough to remember, Iain, but do you recall what the...
Indicating that I no doubt will be.
Do you recall that period of like 95, 96, sort of the dying period of the last...
I do.
Isn't that...
Brooks recalls it better than I do.
Isn't the stench similar to what you're seeing right now, Bruce? I don't know.
Yeah, no, I stood for Parliament in 97. I think, did you as well, Iain?
No.
Okay, well, I did in 97. It was awful. And I have to say, it doesn't feel like that now. Okay, so I think there was... I think in that case, it went back to Black Wednesday. I think we lost all economic credibility, I think, in a different way than the recent budget might have impacted.
How is that different? Because I think there are similarities.
No, I know people are trying to draw similarities, but I don't see it. I don't have as an apocalyptic maybe outlook economically as you do, Hashim, maybe. I think energy prices are going to come down. I think inflation will come down. I think interest rates will come down. And I think
that all happened after Black Wednesday,
just a sec. Let me finish. And let me finish my brief economic analysis. I think the pound will strengthen, and I do think Liz and Kwasi are right to try a supply side solution. We've had almost zero productivity growth. We've had no growth. We've had nothing since 2008. We have to try a different strategy. And I think taking a supply side approach.
Whose fault is that?
Sorry?
Whose fault is that?
Well, I think it's not just us. It's in Europe, and it's the only exception maybe is the US. Who hasn't? So if you look at throughout all of Europe, I think that they've struggled with the same thing. And I think it's this groupthink that goes on. So I think they are right to try something different. So I think my view is, let's give it some time, let's see what happens, and I'm more optimistic than probably most people in this panel.
But if you look at the economic situation in 1997, the economy was doing rather well, and the Conservatives had sort of rescued it from the dark days of 1992, but they got no credit for it because their economic credibility was shot in 1992, just as I think it was whenever it was 2 Fridays ago. And you see the evidence in the opinion polls, 30-point leads, not just one poll, but 4 or 5 showing that level of lead. There's no coming back from that.
I don't know. I guess I'm going to disagree with you, because to me it doesn't feel like it felt in 96, 97.
Bruce, do you really think that? I mean, sorry, Brooks. Do you really think that? Because I travel around the country a lot. I'm a planning lawyer, so I really get to see the breadth. And the last 2 weeks is probably the first time I've genuinely felt people see a Labour government coming forward now. Like, it may not happen, we still got a long way to go, and there's elections 2 years away, but the first time ever, and you can see it in the polls, and they will narrow and get close to the election, etc., etc. But I'm surprised that you don't see that kind of moment now that is really staring us in the face.
Yeah, I can only say what I feel and what I see. So to me, it does not feel like a 92 moment when I was also working in the city at the time. So do I think that they lost credibility? But I think if things move in the direction of travel that I think that they will, which is energy prices coming down, interest rates coming down, inflation coming down, I do think they have at least an 18-month runway to see if that works.
Okay. Jack?
Do I think Liz Truss will be Prime Minister at Christmas? Yes, I do. I think she keeps doing just enough with her speeches, her performance at PMQs to reassure some Tory MPs. And it's also right to say that, most Tory MPs don't want to have another leadership contest. They've just had one.
I love them.
This is a bit ridiculous. I mean,
surely we'll need a general election if they have another one.
This would be unprecedented. No Prime Minister's been turfed out after a few weeks. I mean, I just don't believe it would happen. And it's right to say, like, who would be...
George Canning was, but he died.
He died, so it's a slightly different situation. Who would be the person that took over? However, so I think she'll carry on. I think she'll carry on probably to the next election. But I do also think that she is toast. You only get one chance to make a first impression with the British public. Nobody knew who she was when she came in as Prime Minister. People looked up, saw them make a total hash of the most important thing they were going to do, and what they've done absolutely critically and incredibly stupidly is they've tied the Conservative brand to rising interest rates. Now, interest rates were going to go up anyway because of the global situation, but now, rightly, people will say they're going up because of what you did, and I'm afraid, in my opinion, there is no coming back from that.
And I think this is, for me, I was 6 at the 1997 general election, so I can't talk as Brooks has about what that felt like at the time. But I think the critical difference here is that you have so many people who are locked into 2-year mortgage deals, for example, or long-term energy deals, which will be coming up at some point over the next year. So there are a lot of people that haven't actually felt the bite yet of what's been happening with the economy, and each month more and more people will be affected. It's a kind of rolling catastrophe economically rather than a kind of short, sharp shock. And I think that that's the bit that is just going to absolutely kill the Conservative Party and their chances at the next election, because, as you said, their economic credibility is gone.
And the amazing thing about it is that the Labour Party are, no offence, Charlotte, no great shakes. People are not excited about Keir Starmer around the country in a way that they actually were about Tony Blair in 95, 96. That is not happening at all. But all he has to do now is not make any mistakes, look credible, look normal, even look boring, dare I say it, because people will look at how they can't pay their bills week after week, month after month. They're going to blame the government, and they're going to be right to blame the government. And when it comes down to it, they're going to vote for the other side.
But it's also particularly bad for the Tories, given what we're experiencing is exactly what Rishi Sunak said was coming. And that's also the pretty shocking part of it all, is sort of exactly what he had said would happen if she took these steps is happening. And that, is in of itself quite telling.
OK, thank you very much indeed. We'll take more of your questions in a moment. If you want to send in a question via Alexa, just say, Alexa, send a comment to LBC. It's 8:45.
LBC, Nick Ferrari at breakfast. Back tomorrow morning from 7. Listen on your radio and on Global Player.
Conservative MP and Department for Work and Pensions Minister, Victoria Prentice. Your senior colleague Nadim Zahawi says he wants to limit bad migration. What do you understand by bad migration, Minister?
Well, I don't know that I've ever really defined migration as bad or good. What's important is that we look at the full range of migration. We desperately need the seasonal agricultural workforce, so
Yes.
that would definitely be good migration.
Nick Ferrari at breakfast.
With Motorway, where dealers compete to give you their best price for your car.
LBC. Cross Question with Iain Dale on LBC.
The worst place to be.
It's 8:47 on LBC. Charlotte Nichols, Brooks Newmark, Hashi Mohamed and Jack Blanchard with me taking your calls. Chris is in Croydon. Hello, Chris.
Good evening, Iain. Good evening, panel. Well,
what would you like to ask, Chris?
Yes, my question is this. Should there be mandatory drug tests in workplaces? And what do the panel think of Suella Braverman, the Home Secretary's proposal to reclassify cannabis as a Class A drug?
Right, well, two very difficult questions there. Charlotte, let's come to you first.
I don't think they are that difficult. I frankly thought that Suella Braverman's response was, reefer madness. I think we need to have an evidence-based drugs policy within this country that's based on, as we're seeing with progressive governments around the world, including Biden's intervention this week, a policy that's focused ultimately on harm reduction and liberalisation. I think that when we look at the evidence from the US on cannabis legalisation there, across a number of states, it hasn't meant more people using it and has meant that taking that money out of the underground economy and putting it into the legal regulated space means that people know what they're buying when they're buying it, that they're not funding crime anymore by doing it, and the money that the taxpayer basically gets from the sale of it goes into, treatment programs for people with addiction issues, with, sort of other kinds of drugs. When it comes to mandatory drugs testing in workplaces, I'm not in favour of that. I was a trade union officer for a decade before coming into Parliament, and it was something that drug and alcohol policies at work I did a lot of work on. I think that you can and should have full cause testing, particularly in safety critical roles, train drivers, lorry drivers, people that are doing those sorts of jobs. I think if there's a reason to suspect that people might be under the influence, then absolutely you should test them. But I don't think random testing is a good or progressive thing, not least because some of these things can stay in your system for a very long time. And just because it's in your system doesn't mean that you are impaired potentially. So, I think we need to look at what we can do to offer people support for addiction issues where they've got them, substance misuse issues. But that should be about creating a space within workplaces where people can come forward if they've got concerns about their use of drug or alcohol, rather than, sort of testing them to catch people out and disciplining them. I don't think that's the way to approach it.
Hashi?
I strongly agree with a lot of that. I used to be in the same chambers as Suella. I used to know her in her previous name, Suella Fernandez, rather than Suella Braverman. But no, the less I say, the better in that respect. But let's just say...
Can I disagree with you there? Actually, you've dangled this little morsel now, and it's up to you to deliver on it.
Well, let's just say two things. One is that her politics and my politics are very, very different.
I think we've worked that one out.
Secondly, I wish she'd thought a bit more before she spoke. Clearly that has persisted, and now she's Home Secretary. I could be deported to Rwanda if I'm not careful.
And she would be having dreams about that.
Exactly.
And Rwanda is a lovely place.
It's the new sort of I have a dream speech of I want to send kids back to where they came from. Anyway, very briefly on the drugs, I think the idea that you want to make cannabis a Class A drug is absolutely bonkers for a variety of reasons. First of all, the rest of the world, the rest of the civilized world, is going in the opposite direction, including many American states. It's completely legal in Canada. And so then most of the European countries are headed in that direction. It's a complete waste of time of the police. It's a complete waste.
Just on the police, the Conservative Police and Crime Commissioners as a group are in favour of this.
Well, of criminalising it.
Of putting it to Class A.
Well, these are the elected police constables, so they have absolutely no idea about what policing is like on the ground. They have absolutely no idea about actually policing on the ground, because if you talk to any real police officer, he or she will tell you that I'd rather spend time on actual real Class A drugs that are blighting lives than somebody having a spliff down the road. It criminalizes young children, it causes major issues, and actually controlling it, bringing it into the hands of proper regulation will make sure that we actually do something about this in a proper way. So and the drug testing, I agree very much that it's an administrative hell to try and make every single workplace drug test. But if there are those critical places, doctors, drivers or pilots, I think you should definitely have spot checks if you are suspecting it. But the idea that you're going to make cannabis use a Class A drug is crazy.
Jack?
The 1950s called and they want their Home Secretary back, Iain. There is zero evidence that this would be a good idea. As we've just heard, civilised Western countries around the world are moving in the other direction for a reason. And societies are not collapsing all around the Western world. In fact, quite the opposite. It's allowing police to focus on things that actually matter. Our police in this country are so overstretched. Everybody knows the problems with attending burglaries, with conviction rates on sexual offences and other really serious crimes. The idea that our Home Secretary wants to saddle them with running around chasing people for these very, very minor drug offences and trying to lump this drug in with really serious hard drugs as if they're in any way the same is just
let me play devil's advocate here, because that is my job on these occasions when everybody, I think, is probably going to agree. I don't know if Brooks is or not, but he's nodding. She would probably argue that cannabis is a gateway drug which leads on to hard drugs, and drugs are at the centre driver of a lot of crime in this country. So if you eradicate the drugs problem, you eradicate the crime problem. Have I done that well in the voice of Suella?
Almost. Very little evidence to support it's a gateway drug, by the way.
The only reason it would be a gateway drug is because you're forcing young people that want to get cannabis to go to drug dealers who are selling really hard drugs, and they might start selling them as well. I mean, again, there is no evidence that this Class A prohibition stops people using it. It doesn't work. We tried the war on drugs, and the drugs won.
Brooks.
Yeah, I mean, I remember when this is somebody who spent a little bit of time in Yemen, where GATT was the relaxation of choice.
I'm guessing that's not really the general agreement on tariffs and trade.
No, GATT is a very low level drug that you chew and you store in your cheek. And I remember when Theresa May tried to make it a Class A drug, which I thought was absurd. And
it's banned now. It's banned.
Oh, it's banned, is okay.
Yeah, now it is banned.
I mean,
she did.
So I mean, I'm a libertarian. My view is whatever you want to get up to and smoke or inject yourself with in your own home is up to you. Is my view, as long as you don't impact other people. I think when it comes to marijuana, I mean, the police. I'm amazed that the police and crime commissioners, but I guess they have to be voted as opposed to the police, want to do this because it just uses up an inordinate amount of time. With the police, if they now have to go out, they're already overstretched. Yeah. And now we're giving them even more to do. On the point that I think Charlotte made, which is the sort of, infringing on people's liberties. If it just to simply randomly pick people up and say, we're going to test you, because then it could lead to bosses, if you will, I hate to use that word, bosses who, want to be malicious against certain people who work for them, just to constantly be testing them. And so, no, we're probably vociferously all going to agree on this panel.
Sometimes it's okay to agree when an idea is so stupid. But I suspect even Iain Dale, who's sitting there very quietly and not expressing an opinion.
I have had a massive conversion on drugs, and I used to think, well, yeah, we need to fight the war on drugs. But you're right, it's been lost. If it was, I'm not sure it was ever actually particularly fought, but it has been lost. And you it's a bit like the abortion laws. You can come up with all of the reasons in the world as to why abortion is terrible and all the rest of it. But if you want to go back to backstreet abortions, fine, just abolish the current abortion laws. You have to be pragmatic. And I don't see any point in sort of introducing more draconian drugs laws because they will not work.
I think there's one point in it, and it's Suella Braverman trying to signal to the right of the Tory party that she's their new knight in shining.
Yeah, but what is the right of the Tory party anymore? I mean, Brooks says he's a libertarian. That is now considered to be the right of the Tory party. Yeah. So I know what you mean, though. Right, let's do a final question from Barbara in Greenwich. Barbara, welcome to the programme. What would you like to ask?
Hi. MPs to media scripted, as it's becoming very, very exhausting listening to their script mindset.
So are MPs too media trained? Are you media trained, Charlotte?
No, I've never had any. Genuinely. I think it was Paul Mason sent me a DM when I first got elected offering it, but I didn't take him up on it.
Thank God for that.
Was that a private one?
Pardon?
Was that a private one?
Yeah.
Oh, right.
But as I said, we've never had it. Clearly we get given briefings and things like that from all sorts of places. But, the idea that we come onto these things with a script, I think I'd be much more cogent if I had one.
It's funny because there are MPs that do come on, not with the script, but the number of notes that they have. And you think, you've been in this game long enough to sort of play it by ear a little bit. But it's like, I don't know many MPs that have actually had formal media training, and yet because if you're on the front bench of any party, you kind of have to spin a line to an extent, but maybe it just comes naturally.
But I also think that for shows like this, no offence, that it's you don't necessarily know what people are going to call in with. I've had times where the producers will say to me, like, we expect we're going to be talking about these discussions. I could come in with all the notes in the world on that. But if someone wants to ask us, or as a panel, about, hitting kids and things like that we've discussed previously, that's clearly not going to be in the notes. So why not just treat it as the conversation that it is and try to give the best answer you
Brooks,
can?
did you have media training?
The answer is towards the end, yeah. When I was became a minister, because I had no idea how to talk to the dispatch box, to be blunt. So I was very nervous, and so I got like 3, I think, lessons from somebody. I think to answer the question, I think there are 2 parts to that. I think there are a lot of people who need media training because they can come over as quite wooden and quite stiff. And I think to learning to feel comfortable in speaking is one thing. The other point that I think Iain's making is if you are in government, you have collective responsibility, or even you're in opposition, you have collective responsibility, and you need to know, you need to be on top of what are your key points you want to get. And certainly one of the things I remember being told when I first became an MP is that, you have to make sure you got 1 point, or at the most 3 points you want to get through when you're, in front of a radio or a TV camera. So I don't think media training is a bad thing, and I think probably a lot of MPs could do with it.
Yeah, and they could do with reducing things to 30 seconds, which Hashi and Jack are both going to display for us now.
Very easily. This is what's called the Let Me Be Clear school that people go to. I think it's good to have media training. The only one thing I don't like is when a politician's confronted with something really powerful and emotional and personal. I don't understand why they just don't go, that's terrible, and I'm really sorry that somebody's experiencing that, but this is what we're trying to do. Instead, they just double down. Yeah. Boris used to do that a lot. That's the bit I don't understand.
I think really the time for very, very media-trained politicians has come and gone, and people want their politicians to be authentic now. They want them to be real people. They want them to sound and talk passionately from the heart, and if they say something that's controversial, just say it. That's what people want now. It's been like that for a while, and I think you can overly media-train people so that sort of gets beaten out of them, and I think that's a bad thing.
Right, final fun text from Julie on the Wirral. Some hotels in Liverpool have started cancelling people's hotel bookings for the Eurovision weekend next May, with prices now up to £8,000 a night. If you had been chucked out of your hotel booking for that weekend, where would you go instead?
Warrington. 15 minutes down the road.
That's so predictable. You could have been media trained to give that.
As I said, it's close by,
Okay, right. Warrington is our opener. Jack?
I suppose I'm duty-bound to say Stockport, given I'm from Stockport. Sorry.
Hashi, lighten the mood a bit.
Camp at Anfield.
That would probably cost more than that, to be fair. Brooks?
Might help the team.
No, I think, number one, I don't think people should have their reservations cancelled. I think that's immoral and unethical. But if you are shifted, I think there are plenty of lovely places around Liverpool which have lots of great B&Bs, because I've been up there a few times, that one can stay in and probably have a much nicer accommodation.
Well, I've already booked myself in at my friend in Mould. That's only about half an hour away, so that'll do. Probably charge me £4,000 though. But there we go. Thank you to you all for joining us this evening. Charlotte Nichols, Brooks Newmark, Hashi Mohamed and Jack Blanchard. We have another cross question coming along tomorrow night. David Davis is part of that panel. You're listening to LBC. I'm Iain Dale. It's 9:02.
On your radio, on Global Player, and
Play LBC.
leading Britain's conversation. This is LBC.
From Global's newsroom at 9 o'clock, Russian missile strikes on at least 8 Ukrainian cities have prompted an international outcry. They were the most widespread attacks since the start of the war, causing at least 11 deaths and dozens of injuries. America's calling the military assault horrific, while Britain's describing it as appalling. Paul Garrick is a criminal barrister and judge, and also former international war crimes judge. He's told LBC that war crimes have been committed, but it would be difficult to get Putin before a judge.
He cannot be extradited to the International Criminal Court because he won't allow it. If he ever travelled outside Russia, he could be arrested on a warrant from the International Criminal Court, but I doubt that he will ever travel outside Russia again.
The G7 group of world's most advanced economies is discussing the Ukraine war tomorrow. Nicola Sturgeon has told the SNP's annual conference £20 billion will be invested in the first decade of an independent Scotland. She also said independence would bring harmony to the relationship between Scotland, England and the other devolved nations. The Supreme Court will consider over the next 2 days if Holyrood has the power to call an advisory referendum on independence. LBC's Scotland editor Gina Davidson told LBC this evening that we're not likely to get an answer for 6 to 8 weeks.
could be an early Christmas present for the SNP. Most legal brains say probably not, and they'll say, the Scottish Parliament doesn't have the capacity to hold a referendum. But the people in that hall today, Nicola Sturgeon, emphatically talking about independence as if it was very much on the horizon.
A man's been jailed for a minimum of 23 and a half years after murdering a Canadian woman he met on a dating app. 23-year-old Jack Seppel stabbed his girlfriend, Ashley Wadsworth, who was 19, at the flat they shared in Essex in February. Criminal barristers in England and Wales